Today, I'm going to talk to you about targets for demand satisfied for contraception, particularly a 75% target that is hoped to be achieved in the world's poorest countries by 2030. This is work that I did with Niamh Cahill and Michelle Weinberger. Oops. And so I want to start by just giving a little bit of background. So every year, the United Nations Population Division releases its World Contraceptive Use Database. And this database contains survey estimates or observations of key family planning indicators. And so, as well as the survey observations in the database for 195 countries, the UNPD produces estimates and projections of these indicators. And these estimates and projections are based on a model called the Family Planning Estimation Model. So this model was originally developed by Niamh Cahill, and I updated it during my postdoc at UMass Amherst, and then kind of last year into this year, it's been converted into an OR package, and that work was led by Gregory Garanik. That was published with a paper on this published in 2021. So why is this important? Why do we want to model family planning indicators? So one of the reasons we are interested in doing this is in relation to initiatives. And one example I'm going to give is the Family Planning 2020 initiative. So this initiative started in 2012. It was funded primarily by the Gates Foundation. And the aim was to expand access to contraception, to get 120 million additional users of contraception in the world's poorest countries by the year 2020. Now, it fell short of its targets, and it's been expanded to become FP 2030, which is going to line up nicely with Sustainable Development Goals. But in order to be able to assess progress in the initiative, you need to be able to have estimates and in particular projections of family planning indicators, specifically and importantly, modern contraceptive prevalence, or the proportion of women using contraceptive methods. From having the proportion of women that use a method of contraception, then you can have the number of women that use contraception, and then you can assess if countries are doing well in terms of having additional users of contraceptive methods over the time periods that we're interested in. So these are just some figures from one of the reports, the most recent reports from FP 2020, which was called the Arc of Progress. And so as of July 2020, there were 320 million women and girls using modern contraceptive methods in the world's poorest countries, which are the focus countries of the initiative. And that included 60 million additional users from the year 2012. So they didn't reach 120, but they did really expand access to contraception. As a result of modern contraceptive use, 121 million unintended pregnancies were averted, 21 million unsafe abortions were averted, and 125,000 maternal deaths were averted. And so it's important that we have these indicators to be able to assess all of these things and produce these figures that tell us how important contraceptive use is. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about the composition of contraceptive use, and I'm going to also give you a whirlwind tour of the family planning estimation model, but that's not really the focus of the talk. And so really what we're interested in with the family planning estimation model is getting estimates of this compositional vector, which I'm calling rho here. And that contains 4 proportions, which is the makeup of contraceptive use. So this is going to be divided into the proportion of women that use traditional methods of contraception and the proportion of women that use modern methods of contraception. The two of those combined give you total contraceptive use. The distinction is modern methods are things that many of us are familiar with, like the pill, IUDs, implants. More traditional method use is things like withdrawal or rhythm. Then we have the proportion of women, which is number 3 here, which is the proportion of women who have an unmet need for contraception. So these are the women that want to delay childbearing, but are not using a method of contraception. And so that could be for a number of reasons. They don't have access, or for whatever reason that might be. And then you also have the proportion of women who don't have a need for contraception, because you're always going to want people, or you're always going to have people who want to have children. So we want the breakdown of this compositional vector, and then having these indicators will allow us to get other indicators such as demand satisfied, which is the thing that we're interested in for this particular talk. So I'm just going to give you an example of what some of the data looks like. So the contraceptive use database has data for 195 countries. The data varies in terms of the time periods that we have the data for and the number of observations we have in the various countries. But here's an example of what we have for Afghanistan. So we have survey observations of this thing that we're trying to estimate, which is this breakdown of this compositional vector of contraceptive use in country C at time T. And we denote the observations by Y. So we have observation I associated with country C, observation I that's associated with, or the time that's associated with observation I, or the country that's associated with observation I. And so here then, I'm showing you total contraceptive prevalence. So this is the combination of traditional and modern. On the x-axis, we have the year. On the y-axis, we have the proportion or the prevalence. You can see pretty well how things have been evolving over time in Afghanistan. You can see there's a bit of noise in the data, so we might want to smooth out a bit of that, but we also want to be able to capture some of the, like a lot of the variability that's happening here as well. And so this is where the models become very useful. We often want to fill in gaps that we have in the data over the observation period. And then importantly, we want to project out into the future as well. For unmet need, you can see we only have one observation, and this is actually pretty typical of what we see in the observed data. And so again, we want to be able to get estimates and projections of this, but in this case, we only have one observation in this country, and that's typical in many countries. And so the modeling is going to really help us here because we can set up the model such that we can share information across countries too. And then here I'm just showing you MCPR, which is the modern contraceptive prevalence. So this is just the proportion, this is just the part of the total contraceptive prevalence that's just got modern method users. And again, you can see how that's evolving over time. Okay, so the family planning estimation model, quick summary, and I really mean a quick summary because this is a whole other talk in itself, but I just want to give you a bit of an overview of the way the model is set up. So you can think about it in three parts. We have basically the process modeling part, where we're trying to get a handle on estimates of these indicators. We have the parameters that are controlling what's going on in the process model, and then we have the data model that's going to link the observations, the data, to the thing that we're trying to estimate, or the parameters. So we have these three latent variables. We have to consider the fact that in the model setup, we have constraints on the things that we're trying to estimate. We're trying to estimate these proportions. They all have to sum to 1, and they all have to be between 0 and 1. And so what we do is we consider what I'm going to talk to you about now, which is these ratios, and that helps us with those constraints. And we're going to model these latent variables, which are these ratios, or in some cases, as the sum of a systematic part in the model. So this is like a parametric model, what we expect to happen in these countries. And to that, we're going to add a time series component. So the systematic part helps us model what we expect to happen, but it doesn't capture all of the variation in the data. And so the time series component added to that helps us pick up some of that variation that we wouldn't pick up with, say, if we were just to use a simple regression for the data. So what are these latent variables? P, R, and Z. So P is just the addition of traditional contraceptive use in country C at time T plus modern use in country C at time T. So that's just, P is just the total contraceptive prevalence. Or is the proportion of total prevalence that, or is the ratio of modern contraceptive prevalence to total prevalence. So what proportion of total contraceptive use is modern use, basically. And then Z is the ratio of unmet need to no use. So of the proportion of people that don't use any method of contraception, what proportion of those have an unmet need? And so from here, we can just manipulate these to get back the 4 parts of the compositional vector that we're interested in. And so these are the things that we model, and this is the kind of setup. We have this systematic part denoted with a star here. And so what we use are logistic growth curves and quadratic curves, and we have to do the modeling on the logit scale because we have to be careful about the constraints that we have about everything being between 0 and 1. And then we add on these time series components to pick up that variation, because the data, the observed data, is considered to have quite small errors associated with it. The parameters in this model are estimated hierarchically. So we allow for that sharing of information across countries. So the hierarchy is usually country learns from region, learns from like what's going on across the world. And that's very useful for things like for circumstances where a country doesn't have very much data, or particularly for the unmet need indicators where you've seen we don't have much data either. The data model then, which links everything together, is a multivariate normal data model for log ratios for all but one of the proportions. And again, this is just accounting for the fact that we have these constraints with what we're trying to model. So that's just a quick overview. And really, it's just more so because this is the foundation for what I want to talk about. So I just wanted you to know that the estimates and projections that we get, there's a model underlying all of this. You're welcome to ask me more questions about that at the end if you want to. So the family planning estimation model can be fit on all 195 countries in the World Contraceptive Use Database. And then we have what we call the local family planning estimation model, which is basically a scaled down version of this. And this is what's contained within the ORA package. So we have a country specific version of this family planning estimation model where we can just have data for a particular country and we can get estimates and projections of these indicators. So what I'm showing you here again are the estimates and projections for these indicators from Afghanistan. So the data is informing what's happening here. I'm just not showing the data on these plots here. And what we have are the estimates of total contraceptive prevalence. Now I've expanded out to 2030. And you can see obviously the uncertainty gets wider as we go into the projection period. Unmet need, again, we have the estimates and projections over the same time period. And we have modern contraceptive prevalence, and importantly, we have demand satisfied. And so demand satisfied is actually created as a function of these other indicators, which we get directly from the model. So what do we need to get demand satisfied? We need to know what total demand is, and then we need to know how much of that demand is satisfied with modern contraceptive methods. So the total demand is total contraceptive prevalence. Again, remember, this is traditional, the proportion that use traditional methods plus the proportion that use modern methods is going to be dominated by the proportion that use modern methods. So that's total prevalence. And then plus unmet need, because the people who have an unmet need have a demand, okay? They have an unmet need for contraception. They're part of the cohort of people that have a demand for the contraception. They just can't, they either are not using it for whatever reason or they can't access it. So total demand is the addition of these two indicators here. So total prevalence plus unmet need. And then the demand satisfied is, well, what proportion of that is the ratio of modern contraceptive prevalence to that total demand. So how much of that total demand is been satisfied with modern contraceptive prevalence or with modern contraceptives. And so here we see how the demand satisfied is evolving over time in Afghanistan. And if you think about the title of this talk, and I'm going to talk to you a bit more about this, this target, the target is 75% in 2030. And so if we look at Afghanistan here, in 2030, which is where these projections go out to, if you look at the median estimates, which are kind of our best guess for what might happen in 2030, they're up at about maybe 55% in terms of demand satisfied. So we're not projected to reach the target in Afghanistan. And you can even see, if you take the uncertainty into account and you look at the upper bound of the uncertainty, even within there, we're not likely to reach 75% demand satisfied. So very improbable that we're going to reach that target in Afghanistan. Okay, so just to talk to you and give you a little bit more context for these targets, they're related to the Sustainable Development Goals. So Sustainable Development Goal number 3 is in relation to good health and well-being. There's a target associated with this goal, which is by 2030 to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including for family planning, information and education, and integration of reproductive health into national strategies and programs. The indicator for this target is demand satisfied. So the indicator here says it should be assessing the proportion of women of reproductive age, which is age 15 to 49, who have their need for family planning satisfied with modern methods. A benchmark associated with this is the 75% demand satisfied target that I'm talking to you about today. So a proposed benchmark for this SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal 3.7.1, which is the indicator, is to have at least 75% of the demand for family planning satisfied with modern contraceptives in all countries by 2030. And so what I'm focusing on is the world's poorest countries, but the target is really for all countries. So what's motivated the particular method that I'm going to talk to you about? So we want to assess progress towards this target. We want to see for all of these countries that are the focus of this FP 2020 initiative, which make up the world's poorest countries. We want to assess how they're doing in terms of meeting this target. The method that we're proposing, or that we proposed to assess this, is called the accelerated transition method. And so there's some motivation for why we explored this in the first place. So if we consider what's happening in terms of business as usual, this is what we expect to happen if nothing else changes. So if you think about what I just showed you from Afghanistan, we have these estimates and these projections in the absence of having any other information or any other data. This is what we expect to happen in Afghanistan in 2030. Okay, these are our best guesses of what we think will happen in terms of these indicators. So that's our business as usual. And we can use these to assess if countries are on track to meet this target. And I gave an example of that for Afghanistan, and we saw that Afghanistan is not on track to meet this target. So for countries like Afghanistan that are not currently projected to meet this, what we're calling DS75, so 75% demand satisfied by 2030, these countries are going to require what we'll call a larger than business as usual increase in the number of users of modern methods of contraception. So if in order to meet 75% demand satisfied, they're going to have to increase their contraceptive prevalence rate. Otherwise, they're not going to meet that target. So what does this mean? This means that any kind of progress assessments that we do in terms of reaching this demand satisfied target, DS75, is going to require knowing what target levels of MCPR should be, or at least having our best estimates, or our model informed best estimates of what MCPR should be if we hope to reach the target in 2030. What we don't want to do is base the targets on just looking at 75% of the total demand. It's not sufficient. So if you consider the total demand, which I told you was total contraceptive prevalence plus unmet need, so you can have estimates of total demand and you can see what it is in 2030. And you can consider, okay, let's just get 75% of total demand. That's what we need to aim for. 75% of total projected demand in 2030 will give us the MCPR that we need in 2030, and job done. But that's actually not the case, because if we took that as our estimate of MCPR in countries that are not currently on track to meet this target, what will happen is that increase in MCPR that we assume that we need should also result in an increase in demand, and that wouldn't be accounted for. We would assume that the demand is staying the same no matter what happens in terms of modern contraceptive prevalence. But if you have programs that are trying to increase contraceptive use, they're likely to increase the demand for contraception as well. So the work that these FP programs are doing in terms of trying to increase access to contraception are likely going to increase the demand for contraception. So you need to take account of the fact that demand is also going to increase if contraceptive use increases. And then what you're at when you get to 2030 is your target is going to be an underestimate of where you actually need to be. So we need the MCPR targets to be estimated with a consideration of this fact that increases in MCPR are likely going to coincide with increases in demand. And this is where the accelerated transition method comes in. So I'm going to talk to you about talk you through a little bit of notation first, and then I'm going to show you a picture that hopefully helps illustrate all this. So T star is going to be the earliest year in which countries are currently expected to reach DS75, which is 75% demand satisfied. So we look at our projections. For example, in Afghanistan, we see what year are we actually projected to reach DS75? What year are we actually projected to get this 75% demand satisfied? So we can project out way beyond 2030. Obviously, we have more uncertainty the further we go, but we can get our best estimates of the year in which we expect this to be achieved. And that's our T star. T current is just the current year. DEM C 2030 is the demand in country C in 2030. And this mod CT star is the modern contraceptive prevalence rate in country C in the year in which the target is expected to be achieved. So this is our modern contraceptive prevalence in this year when we expect DS75 to be reached. And so what we're interested in is the MCPR that we need to be associated with the target. So we need the target level of MCPR. That's what we're interested in. And we're going to call that T mod C. If the country is on track to meet the demand satisfied in 2030, then we're happy enough to take 75% of whatever demand is in 2030, and that's fine because they're on track to meet it anyway. So that's going to be our estimate of what the modern contraceptive prevalence should be. If the country is not on track to meet it, then we're going to say our best target associated MCPR is whatever the MCPR is in the year in which the target is supposed to be achieved. So to illustrate this, we have 75% of demand, we have MCPR, we have total demand shown here on this graph, okay? So we have these different indicators over time, and this is again for Afghanistan. So this is just to illustrate the point I've made on the last slide. So when the red line, which is 75% of the blue line, and the green line, which is MCPR, where they overlap is when 75% demand satisfied is going to be achieved. And so in Afghanistan, this happens in 2054. So that demand satisfied is not expected to reach 75% until 2054 in Afghanistan. So what we want to do, or what we're saying with this method, is that we need to reach this level of modern contraceptive prevalence, but we need to reach it 24 years earlier. Or Afghanistan at least needs to reach it 24 years earlier if they want to achieve the target by this year. So we need the modern contraceptive prevalence rate to get up or to accelerate up to this level by 2030. And this is where the name, the accelerated transition method, comes from, because we need to accelerate the modern contraceptive prevalence transition, basically. It needs to go faster in order to reach this level by 2030. And it's currently only expected to reach this level by 2030. And then with that, the demand is also likely to be at higher levels, that are the levels that are associated with this level of MCPR. So the demand is also likely to increase in 2030 if we get this increase in modern contraceptive prevalence. The red dot here is showing you just what the target will be if we went for 75% of demand in this year. Okay, so that would just be whatever the point that we're at here in this red line. And if we went with that, we get a much lower estimate than we get for the green point for the target level of MCPR that we need. What we're saying is this wouldn't account for the fact that if we jumped up to here, so if we jumped up to here by 2030, it's not accounting for the fact that we're also likely to jump up here as well, or at least a little bit below this in terms of demand. And so our method accounts for this increase because we're just assuming that the levels that we have of demand here are going to coincide with what we see when we reach the target. Okay, so from here we derive two quantities, and these are quite simple. Once we have these target values of MCPR and we know the year in which the target was supposed to, or is expected to be achieved, we can get what we call the MCPR target gap. This is basically where a country needs to go. So where the country is in terms of MCPR currently versus where we want it to go in 2030 if the target is to be, if the demand satisfied of 75% is to be achieved. So this gap provides the percentage point difference between the target MCPR, so the MCPR associated with reaching 75% demand satisfied, and the current MCPR in the country. Or on the MCPR that's currently projected for 2030, actually. So the gap in where the country needs to get to in 2030. The relative acceleration then is going to kind of quantify what the speed up is. And this is very, very simple. So it's just the difference in where the year in which the DS75 is projected to be achieved minus the current year. So the number of years it's expected to take currently, basically, divided by the number of years we want it to take. So we want it to happen by 2030. And so this just allows us to quantify the speed up that's required. For example, if a required relative acceleration is 2, that means that the country must achieve the target 2 times faster, or in half the number of years than it's currently expected to do. So, for example, if the country is not currently projected to reach demand satisfied of 75% until, let's say, like 2038, and we want the country to reach it in 2030, rather than achieving it in 9 years, or rather than achieving it in 18 years, we want to achieve it in 9 years. So it's in half the number of years, and that would result in a relative acceleration of 2. It's useful to be able to quantify this, because then these kind of quantifications are useful for planners, because we can say, okay, well, here's what this country needs to do, and then this country needs to actually speed up about 4 times. So it gives us a method of comparing across different countries as well. And so onto some results. So we basically did this for all of the countries, all of the focus countries of the FP 2020 initiative. So we got these target values of MCPR, and we found the years in which the countries are currently expected to reach 75% demand satisfied. And we found that 50 out of the 68 countries require an acceleration. So some countries are on track, and that's fine. And we were able to highlight those. But 50 of the 68 require an acceleration in their FP transition, their family planning transition, between 29, because that was the year we did the paper, and 2030, in order to meet the demand satisfied of 75% by 2030. And the gaps range from 4.3 percentage points in Sri Lanka up to 50.8 percentage points in Somalia. So some countries, the gap is just, they're not going to bridge that gap by 2030. And so for some countries, this target is just not going to be achievable in this time frame, which is also useful information. So what I'm showing you here on this graph is the demand satisfied associated, or the DS75 associated MCPR. So this is the target MCPR. This is the MCPR that's needed in order to reach the demand satisfied. And then here is the year on the x-axis, which is covered now, is the year in which it's projected to be achieved. And so the colors then reflect the relative acceleration. So obviously, the further away the projection is in terms of DS75, the bigger the acceleration that's going to be required is. And so for these countries over here, you're looking at a relative acceleration of less than 2. So they only need to do it in half the number of years or less, which is probably achievable or potentially achievable. And then as you move over here to the right, you're getting to countries that need to speed up more and more, and the target gaps are getting bigger. And for these countries, it's unlikely to be achievable. So when you're out here in Somalia or Chad, for example, the gaps that they need to bridge or the speed up that is required for those countries is up to like a relative acceleration of about 7, so 7 times faster than current projections, and it's just very unlikely to happen in the time frame. And then just to compare assessment methods, so I mentioned that you could just take 75% of demand in 2030 and have that as your estimate for your modern contraceptive prevalence rate. But if you compare what I'm calling the demand-based method, which is that taking 75% of total demand in 2030, versus our method that we've mentioned here, which is the accelerated transition method, what you see is that when the target gaps, these are the target gaps for these countries based on these methods, and as the target gaps get bigger, you get much lower estimates in the demand-based method than you do in the accelerated transition method. And so our fear is that using this method, this demand-based method, not accounting for the fact that demand is likely to increase as modern contraceptive prevalence increases, you're going to underestimate the modern contraceptive prevalence that's needed to reach the target. So we want to just avoid that. And again, these are just colored by the relative acceleration that's needed. Okay, so just to conclude then, basically what we did in this paper is we highlighted the countries that have achieved or are on track to achieve the target. So we were able to see what countries are on track. But for countries that were not on track, we were able to quantify the acceleration needed as compared to business as usual for countries to meet their targets, or this 75% target. We found that substantial accelerations are needed in many countries, with required increases ranging from 4.3 up to 50.8 percentage points. We feel that the main contributions of this method is to make these targets actionable. So the method provides MCPR associated targets. So you have a number of MCPR that you need to get to, That provides direct information on the number of women needing modern contraceptives under the target. So you can have the proportion, and you have the population of women in a given country. You can find the numbers that you need to reach. And we hope that this information would aid in the implementation of successful programs, because the more informed you are, even if it's looking like targets aren't going to be reached, that's still useful information. And then just to finish, the approach, we think, kind of highlights the need for actual country-specific targets, because 75% across the globe is not really realistic, and we've seen that from many countries. And so making targets country-specific, so that it's at least within the realm of possibility for some of these poorer countries, will be more beneficial. So yeah, thank you very much. Just these are some references, the paper for this work, as well as some other things that I've mentioned as I went through. So thank you very much.